They say you can tell a man's worth by the car he drives. That was the biggest mistake they ever made. The morning I drove my old dark green Ford pickup into the headquarters of Hawthorne Industrial Systems, every security camera captured the same picture. An aging truck with faded paint rolled slowly past a row of polished luxury sedans and black sport utility vehicles worth more than most American families earned in a year. Employees crossing the parking lot glanced in my direction before looking away with quiet amusement. A few smiled politely. Others did not bother hiding their laughter. I had seen those looks before. After 67 years of life, they no longer surprised me. My name is Thomas Bennett, and for most of my adult life I owned a small machine shop 40 miles outside Louisville, Kentucky. My father had started the business after returning home from military service with little more than determination and a second-hand lathe. He taught me that every customer deserved the same respect whether they ordered 1 bolt or 1,000. We never became famous. We never built skyscrapers. We simply delivered quality work, paid our employees fairly, and honored every promise we made. It was an ordinary life, and I had never wanted anything different. But ordinary lives sometimes carry extraordinary secrets. As I parked near the visitor entrance, I shut off the engine and rested both hands on the worn steering wheel for a moment. The truck had more than 300,000 miles on it. Every scratch reminded me of another project completed, another shipment delivered, another late night spent making payroll during difficult years. Buying a luxury vehicle had never interested me. I preferred investing in people instead of appearances. Before stepping out, I reached into the passenger seat and picked up a simple leather folder containing documents that would change more lives than anyone inside the building could possibly imagine. The folder looked almost too ordinary for what it represented. That made me smile. Walking toward the glass entrance, I noticed 2 young executives standing beside the revolving door. Their tailored suits probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. One glanced at my boots, then at my truck, and quietly whispered something to his colleague. They both chuckled before holding the door open with the kind of exaggerated politeness reserved for people they considered harmless. I thanked them sincerely and stepped inside. The marble lobby reflected morning sunlight through towering windows, filling the building with the confidence money often creates. Receptionists answered phones with practiced efficiency while visitors waited in expensive chairs beneath a polished company logo stretching across an elegant stone wall. I walked to the reception desk and introduced myself. The young receptionist smiled professionally until she looked at my appointment confirmation. Her expression changed ever so slightly before she asked me to wait because someone from the executive floor would personally escort me upstairs. Around the lobby, conversation slowed. Curious eyes drifted toward the old man in worn work boots carrying an inexpensive leather folder. Nobody there understood why the chairman of the board had cancelled an entire morning of meetings for a visitor who looked like he had just climbed out of an aging pickup truck. They assumed I had arrived to ask for something. The truth was far more interesting. By the end of that day, the company they proudly walked into every morning would belong to me. The receptionist asked me to take a seat near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Louisville. I thanked her, placed my worn leather folder on the small table beside me, and quietly observed the rhythm of the building. People hurried across the marble floor carrying laptops, expensive coffee, and the confidence that comes from believing tomorrow will look exactly like today. Every few minutes another executive glanced in my direction before continuing on. Most assumed I was an aging supplier hoping to negotiate another contract. One young manager walked past twice, each time studying my old boots with barely concealed curiosity. I did not blame him. Appearance has always been the easiest story for people to believe. 10 minutes later the elevator doors opened, and a sharply dressed assistant approached with a practiced smile. She introduced herself as Emily Foster, executive assistant to Chairman Charles Hawthorne. Her professionalism stood out immediately because she never looked at my truck through the windows or judged the faded denim jacket resting over my arm. She simply extended her hand and said the chairman was ready to receive me. As we rode toward the executive floor, she mentioned that the entire board had adjusted its schedule to accommodate the meeting. I smiled politely but offered no explanation. The fewer assumptions people corrected too early, the more honestly they revealed themselves. When the elevator doors opened, the atmosphere changed. Thick carpets replaced polished stone. Original artwork decorated the walls. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Ohio River, while quiet conversations drifted from conference rooms lined with glass. Emily escorted me into an elegant waiting area outside the boardroom. Through the transparent wall, I recognized several familiar faces from financial magazines and business television interviews. Charles Hawthorne stood near the head of the long walnut table speaking with directors, attorneys, and investment advisors. None of them noticed me at first. When Charles finally turned toward the waiting area, his expression froze for the briefest moment before he quickly recovered and walked toward the door himself. We had not seen each other in almost 30 years. Age had added silver to both our hair, but I recognized the determined look in his eyes immediately. He greeted me warmly, shook my hand with genuine respect, and thanked me for accepting his invitation. The executives around the table exchanged puzzled glances. They had clearly expected another billionaire in a tailored suit rather than a man who looked as though he had driven straight from a machine shop. Charles invited me to sit beside him rather than across from him. That single gesture confused everyone even more. Before anyone could begin the presentation, one director politely cleared his throat and asked the question everyone else seemed unwilling to voice. He wondered whether there had been some misunderstanding about the agenda. Charles looked toward me, smiled slightly, and replied that there had been no misunderstanding whatsoever. He explained that the future of Hawthorne Industrial Systems depended upon the conversation about to take place and that every person in the room should listen very carefully. Silence settled across the boardroom. I placed the old leather folder on the polished table and slowly opened it. Inside rested several neatly organized documents, each bearing the signatures of attorneys, trustees, and financial institutions from across the country. No one spoke as I carefully arranged the papers before me. The confidence that had filled the room only minutes earlier quietly gave way to curiosity, because for the first time that morning they realized the old man who had arrived in an aging pickup truck had not come seeking an opportunity. He had come carrying one. The oldest attorney in the room leaned forward first. He adjusted his glasses, carefully lifted the top document from the folder, and read only the first page before quietly placing it back on the table. His expression changed so quickly that several directors immediately noticed. He looked toward Charles Hawthorne, then back at me, before asking whether every supporting document had already been verified. Charles answered with complete confidence that they had been reviewed repeatedly by 3 independent law firms over the previous 6 months. The attorney nodded slowly without another word. The room grew noticeably quieter. I remained perfectly still. Years spent running a machine shop had taught me that the strongest position in any negotiation belonged to the person who felt no need to impress anyone. Charles finally stood and addressed the board. He explained that nearly 3 decades earlier, when Hawthorne Industrial Systems had nearly collapsed during a severe manufacturing recession, an anonymous investment partnership had quietly provided emergency financing that allowed the company to survive. The agreement had been deliberately structured to avoid public attention because the investors believed the company deserved the opportunity to rebuild without becoming the subject of financial speculation. Most of the executives around the table had never heard that story. Several younger board members exchanged surprised looks. One director admitted he had always believed the company recovered through traditional bank financing. Charles gently shook his head. That had been the public story, but it was not the complete truth. He turned toward me before continuing. The anonymous partnership had never sold its ownership interest. Instead, it had patiently increased its position over the years through legally negotiated agreements, reinvested dividends, and carefully executed purchases whenever opportunities appeared. Every transaction had been fully documented, completely transparent, and entirely lawful. Today that partnership held a controlling interest in Hawthorne Industrial Systems. Another silence filled the room, heavier than the first. One executive instinctively reached for a calculator while another began reviewing digital reports on a tablet. Their confidence slowly transformed into disbelief. Finally someone asked the question everyone wanted answered. Who actually owned the partnership? Charles smiled slightly before looking directly at me. I answered for the first time since entering the boardroom. I told them that after my father passed away, he left behind something far more valuable than the machine shop everyone knew about. For decades he had quietly invested every extra dollar the business earned instead of expanding his own lifestyle. While other companies chased appearances, he purchased opportunity. He believed great businesses should be owned by people who understood honest work. Before his death, he placed the entire investment partnership into a family trust and named me its sole trustee. I had spent 30 years honoring his instructions exactly as he had written them. I never interfered with management because the company continued growing under capable leadership. I never demanded recognition because recognition was never the purpose. But several months earlier Charles contacted me after announcing his retirement. He believed the next generation of leadership needed an owner who cared more about the company's future than quarterly headlines. As those words settled across the boardroom, the executives who had silently judged the old pickup truck that morning began looking at me very differently. For the first time, they realized the man they had mistaken for an aging supplier had quietly owned the majority of the building they had walked into every single day for years without ever knowing his name. For several long moments, nobody reached for the documents in front of them. The silence inside the boardroom became almost uncomfortable because every executive understood that the assumptions they had carried into the meeting were collapsing one after another. Charles Hawthorne finally broke the silence by inviting everyone to review the complete ownership structure that had been prepared by the legal team. Thick binders were quietly distributed around the table. Page after page confirmed the same remarkable story. The Bennett Family Trust, managed through the investment partnership my father had established decades earlier, legally controlled a majority of the voting shares of Hawthorne Industrial Systems. Every acquisition had been reported, audited, and approved under federal regulations. There had never been a hostile takeover. There had never been secret dealings. There had only been patience. One director leaned back in his chair and admitted that he had spent 25 years studying corporate acquisitions yet had never witnessed anything like it. Another executive looked toward Charles and asked why he had kept such extraordinary information hidden from the board for so many years. Charles answered honestly. He explained that confidentiality agreements protected the trust, but more importantly, he had honored the wishes of the Bennett family. They never wanted publicity. They believed ownership carried responsibility, not celebrity. My father often said that if people worked harder trying to build companies than trying to impress strangers, America would have more successful businesses and fewer forgotten communities. Those words still guided every important decision I made. I looked around the table and noticed something interesting. Nobody was smiling anymore. The same people who had quietly judged my appearance downstairs were now studying every sentence I spoke. Respect had replaced amusement without anyone mentioning the old pickup parked outside. One younger executive finally gathered enough courage to ask me a direct question. He wondered why a man who controlled a company worth billions still drove a truck that most people would have traded in years earlier. I smiled because it was an honest question rather than an insult. I told him that the truck had never once failed to get me where I needed to go. It carried tools instead of status. It reminded me every morning where my family came from. I explained that wealth should expand your freedom, not your ego. If buying expensive things became necessary to prove success, then success probably had not been achieved in the first place. Several people quietly nodded. Even those who disagreed seemed unwilling to argue. Charles folded his hands and announced that his retirement would become effective at the end of the month. According to the succession agreement approved years earlier, the controlling owner would determine the next chapter of the company. Every eye in the room turned toward me once again. They expected me to announce a new chief executive officer, replace half the board, or begin celebrating the largest corporate transition in company history. Instead, I slowly closed the leather folder, thanked Charles for protecting the company with integrity, and told everyone that before I made a single decision about leadership, I first wanted to understand the character of every person sitting around that table. Financial statements revealed how a company performed. Character revealed whether it deserved to keep growing. The room became perfectly still once again because they finally realized this meeting had never been about ownership alone. It was about proving who was worthy of leading what my father had quietly spent a lifetime preserving. No one objected when I suggested postponing every vote scheduled for that morning. In fact, the request seemed to relieve several members of the board. They had entered the conference room expecting an ordinary business meeting, but within an hour they had learned that the quiet man in work boots possessed both the legal authority and the patience to reshape the future of the entire corporation. I stood and walked slowly toward the windows overlooking the city. From that height I could barely make out my old pickup sitting alone in the visitor parking lot among rows of polished luxury vehicles. It reminded me of something my father used to say. He believed that the distance between humility and arrogance could often be measured by how quickly success made people forget where they had started. Turning back toward the board, I asked each executive to introduce themselves, not by listing their titles or achievements, but by explaining why they had first chosen to work for Hawthorne Industrial Systems. At first the request seemed unusual. Then one by one they answered. Some spoke about engineering, others about innovation, and a few admitted they had simply accepted the best opportunity available at the time. As the conversation continued, I listened far more carefully to what they did not say than to what they did. Very few mentioned the employees who built the products. Very few spoke about customers. Nearly everyone discussed profits, market share, or investor expectations. None of those goals were wrong, but I had learned long ago that numbers followed people, not the other way around. Charles watched quietly without interrupting. He understood exactly what I was looking for because years earlier he had learned the same lesson. Eventually I stopped beside one of the younger executives who had quietly laughed near the lobby entrance earlier that morning. His name was Ryan Mitchell, Vice President of Strategic Development. He was intelligent, ambitious, and clearly capable. I asked him what he had thought when he first saw me walk into the building. The room became completely silent. Ryan hesitated before taking a slow breath. To his credit, he did not invent a polite answer. He admitted that he had assumed I was an aging vendor or perhaps someone who had arrived at the wrong address. He confessed that he had judged me entirely by my clothes and my truck. I thanked him for his honesty. Then I explained that poor judgment was rarely the result of limited intelligence. More often it came from moving through life too quickly to notice the value standing directly in front of us. I told the board that mistakes could always be forgiven when people were willing to learn from them. Pride, however, was much more expensive because it prevented learning altogether. Several members lowered their eyes. Nobody argued. The atmosphere inside the room had changed from corporate confidence to genuine reflection. Before ending the meeting, I announced only one immediate decision. Over the next 30 days I would visit every major facility the company operated across the country. I would spend time with machinists, warehouse workers, engineers, receptionists, truck drivers, and maintenance crews before making a single leadership appointment. If I was going to guide the future of the company my father had quietly protected for decades, I intended to understand the people who created its success long before I decided who deserved to lead it. 3 days later I left before sunrise in the same old pickup truck, heading toward the company's largest manufacturing facility outside Indianapolis. Charles had arranged the visit without informing local management exactly who would be arriving. The only instruction they received was that a representative of the ownership group wished to observe operations without ceremony or special preparation. That was exactly how I wanted it. Businesses revealed their true character when nobody believed they were being evaluated. The factory covered hundreds of thousands of square feet, and the parking lot was already filling with employees arriving for the morning shift. I parked beside several older vehicles near the back instead of using the reserved executive spaces near the entrance. Carrying nothing more than my leather folder and a simple notebook, I walked through the employee entrance after receiving a visitor badge from security. The plant manager greeted me politely enough, although it was obvious he assumed I was another consultant hired to produce reports that would eventually collect dust on a shelf. He explained production targets, efficiency metrics, and quarterly growth projections while leading me through spotless hallways decorated with motivational slogans. I listened carefully but asked very few questions until we reached the production floor. The sound of machinery immediately reminded me of my own shop back in Kentucky. Steel, precision, discipline, and teamwork all spoke the same language regardless of the size of the building. Instead of following the scheduled tour, I quietly stepped away from the management group and walked toward a machinist carefully inspecting finished components. His name tag read David Morales. He had worked there for 28 years. I introduced myself simply as Thomas and asked him to explain what he was doing. His face brightened immediately. For nearly 15 minutes he described the manufacturing process with genuine pride, pointing out small improvements his team had suggested over the years that had reduced waste and improved quality. None of those ideas appeared in the executive presentation I had received earlier that morning. As we continued walking, similar conversations unfolded everywhere. A maintenance technician proudly showed me a repair that prevented unnecessary downtime. A warehouse supervisor explained how employees voluntarily reorganized storage areas after hours to improve safety. A receptionist knew dozens of workers by name and quietly helped families through difficult moments without expecting recognition. Everywhere I looked, ordinary people were protecting the company's future through thousands of small decisions that never appeared in financial reports. During lunch I chose to eat in the employee cafeteria instead of the executive dining room. Several workers invited me to join them without knowing who I really was. They spoke honestly about their hopes for the company. Most loved their jobs but worried that senior leadership had become increasingly disconnected from the people on the factory floor. They believed decisions were being made by executives who studied spreadsheets more often than they visited production lines. I thanked them for their honesty without revealing my position. By the time I returned to the parking lot that afternoon, I had filled an entire notebook with observations. The future of Hawthorne Industrial Systems was becoming much clearer. The company's greatest asset was not the equipment, the patents, or even the billions reflected on its balance sheet. Its greatest strength sat at lunch tables, operated machines, answered telephones, repaired equipment, and quietly carried the business forward every single day while many leaders had forgotten to notice. During the following 3 weeks I visited every major operation Hawthorne Industrial Systems owned. I drove the same pickup truck through manufacturing towns, distribution centers, research laboratories, and regional offices across 5 states. I stayed in modest hotels, ate breakfast at local diners, and spent more time listening than speaking. Word gradually spread that an older visitor named Thomas was asking unusual questions, but very few people understood who I actually was. That anonymity became my greatest advantage because employees spoke freely when they believed they were talking to someone who genuinely wanted to understand their work instead of evaluating their performance. The stories I heard were remarkably consistent. People took enormous pride in the company and respected Charles Hawthorne for the culture he had built over the years. At the same time, many quietly worried that several ambitious executives had become increasingly focused on short-term financial victories rather than long-term stability. Engineers described research projects delayed because immediate profits received higher priority. Plant supervisors explained how experienced employees were retiring faster than new workers were being trained. Customer service representatives told me about clients who remained loyal for decades because individual employees had solved problems with honesty rather than excuses. Everywhere I traveled I found evidence that the company's strongest competitive advantage had never been technology alone. It was trust. One afternoon I visited a small supplier outside Cincinnati that had manufactured specialized components for Hawthorne Industrial Systems for almost 40 years. The owner, an elderly woman named Margaret Collins, welcomed me into her office without recognizing me. Framed photographs covered the walls, showing generations of employees standing proudly beside finished products. She explained that Charles Hawthorne had always honored handshake agreements even before lawyers prepared formal contracts. That simple habit had allowed dozens of family businesses like hers to survive difficult economic times. Then her smile faded slightly. She admitted that recent negotiations with certain corporate executives had become noticeably colder. Every conversation centered on squeezing another fraction of a percentage point from suppliers who had already sacrificed enough. She feared that if the culture continued changing, many small American manufacturers would disappear forever. Her word stayed with me during the drive back to Kentucky. My father had warned me about exactly this kind of thinking decades earlier. He believed businesses failed long before their financial statements revealed trouble. They failed the moment leaders stopped seeing people as partners and started treating them merely as numbers. Several days later I returned to headquarters carrying 2 notebooks completely filled with observations. Charles met me in his office overlooking the city skyline. Without discussing a single financial report, we spent hours comparing stories from employees, customers, suppliers, and managers. By the end of the conversation we reached the same conclusion independently. The company was financially healthy, technologically advanced, and respected throughout the industry, but its greatest challenge would not come from competitors. It would come from deciding whether the next generation of leadership understood the difference between building quarterly profits and building a legacy that families could trust for generations. As I looked once more toward the parking lot where my weathered pickup still waited among luxury vehicles, I realized the most important decision of my life was no longer whether I could buy the company. That question had already been answered years earlier. The real question was whether I could find leaders wise enough to deserve inheriting everything my father had spent a lifetime quietly protecting. The board of directors gathered again on the first Monday after my tour concluded. This time the atmosphere inside the conference room felt completely different from our first meeting. Nobody glanced toward the windows to see what vehicle I had arrived in. Nobody whispered when I entered. Emily Foster welcomed me with the same warm professionalism she had shown from the beginning, and Ryan Mitchell was already standing beside the conference table. As soon as I walked into the room, he extended his hand and thanked me for giving him the opportunity to learn from his first impression rather than be permanently judged by it. I accepted his handshake because sincere humility deserved encouragement. Charles Hawthorne opened the meeting by reviewing the findings from my visits across the company. Instead of beginning with financial performance, he projected photographs of employees from factories, laboratories, warehouses, and customer service centers. Every image represented people I had personally met. I spoke for nearly an hour, but I never mentioned stock prices, market capitalization, or quarterly earnings. Instead, I shared stories. I described David Morales, whose attention to detail protected product quality every single day. I spoke about Margaret Collins, whose family business had faithfully supplied components for decades because trust had always mattered more than aggressive negotiations. I mentioned the receptionist who quietly supported employees through personal hardships without expecting recognition. As each story unfolded, the board slowly realized something important. None of those individuals appeared on investor presentations, yet without them the company would not deserve its reputation. After the discussion ended, I distributed a single sheet of paper to every director. It contained 5 principles that my father had written by hand many years earlier. Build trust before profit. Protect people before protecting pride. Reward character before talent. Think in decades instead of quarters. Leave every business stronger than you found it. I explained that every future decision made by the ownership group would be measured against those principles. If a proposal produced higher profits but violated those values, it would not receive my approval. Several directors carefully reread the page before placing it beside their notebooks. The room remained quiet until Ryan unexpectedly asked permission to speak. He admitted that during the past several years he had pursued rapid promotion so aggressively that he had gradually stopped listening to employees outside executive offices. After hearing the stories from the company tour, he requested permission to spend 1 week every quarter working alongside factory teams and customer service representatives. He believed leadership should be earned through understanding rather than authority. His request surprised everyone, including Charles. I smiled because genuine growth rarely announced itself with dramatic speeches. It appeared through simple choices made after difficult lessons. Other executives began offering similar commitments. One proposed restoring apprenticeship programs for skilled trades. Another recommended creating long-term partnerships with smaller American suppliers instead of constantly searching for cheaper alternatives. For the first time since entering headquarters in my old pickup truck, I could feel the culture beginning to shift. The company had not changed because ownership changed hands. It was changing because people were finally willing to see one another differently. As the meeting came to a close, Charles quietly handed me a sealed envelope that had been waiting for years. He explained that my father had instructed him to deliver it only after I had truly met the people whose future would one day rest in my hands. I looked down at the familiar handwriting on the front of the envelope, realizing that although my father had been gone for many years, he still had one final lesson waiting for me. After everyone had left the boardroom, I remained alone for several minutes holding the sealed envelope in my hands. The handwriting across the front belonged unmistakably to my father. Time had slightly faded the ink, but the careful strokes of each letter looked exactly as I remembered from the notes he left around our small machine shop when I was young. Charles quietly closed the door behind him, leaving me alone with memories that reached back more than 40 years. I slowly opened the envelope and unfolded several handwritten pages. The first sentence immediately brought a smile to my face. My father wrote that if I was reading those words, it meant I had finally met the people whose lives mattered more than the buildings, machines, or financial statements connected to the company. He reminded me that businesses did not exist to make paper wealth. They existed to give ordinary families the opportunity to build meaningful lives through honest work. The letter contained no legal instructions because those had already been completed years earlier. Instead, it offered wisdom earned through decades of quiet observation. He warned me that the greatest temptation facing successful leaders was believing they alone deserved the credit for accomplishments built by thousands of unseen hands. He encouraged me to spend as much time listening to employees in work boots as to executives in tailored suits because both perspectives were necessary to make wise decisions. One sentence stood apart from all the others. Never punish people for judging your appearance. Teach them to recognize character instead. I read those words twice before carefully folding the pages back into the envelope. They explained why my father had always chosen humility over recognition even after becoming extraordinarily successful. He understood that the strongest lesson rarely came through embarrassment. It came through unexpected grace. Later that afternoon, I invited Ryan Mitchell to join me for coffee at a small family-owned diner several miles from headquarters. He seemed surprised that I had selected such an ordinary place instead of an exclusive restaurant. As we sat in a corner booth, I asked him about his childhood, his family, and the reasons he entered business in the first place. The conversation had nothing to do with quarterly reports or corporate strategy. For the first time since meeting him, I saw the ambitious executive disappear and the thoughtful young man beneath emerge. He admitted that growing up in a struggling household had made him afraid of failure. Success had gradually become something he believed he needed to display rather than quietly earn. I shared a few stories about my own father and the old machine shop where every paycheck depended upon keeping promises. By the time we finished our meal, neither of us had spoken about promotions or ownership. We had spoken only about responsibility. As we walked toward my weathered pickup truck, Ryan looked at it with entirely different eyes than he had on the morning we first met. He smiled and admitted that it now represented something he hoped never to forget. I handed him the spare notebook containing observations from every factory and office I had visited. I asked him to read every page carefully before our next board meeting because leadership would soon require more than intelligence. It would require the courage to place people ahead of personal ambition. As he accepted the notebook with genuine gratitude, I quietly realized that my father's final lesson had already begun changing the company in exactly the way he had hoped it someday would. 2 weeks after giving Ryan the notebook, the board assembled once more to decide the future leadership of Hawthorne Industrial Systems. The mood inside the conference room no longer carried uncertainty. Instead, it reflected quiet anticipation. During the previous month, every executive had been asked to spend meaningful time away from corporate offices and alongside employees throughout the company. I had not required presentations or written reports. I simply wanted them to experience the business through different eyes. As the meeting began, I immediately noticed subtle changes. Conversations were less about titles and more about people. Ryan opened the discussion by sharing what he had learned while working several days on the factory floor beside David Morales and his team. He admitted that before those visits he believed efficiency came primarily from management decisions. Now he understood that many of the company's greatest improvements had originated from Employees who had never expected recognition. Another executive described traveling with customer service representatives to visit longtime clients. She confessed that she had underestimated how much loyalty depended upon trust built over decades rather than pricing strategies prepared inside conference rooms. One by one, the directors shared similar experiences. Instead of defending old assumptions, they openly discussed lessons learned. Charles Hawthorne remained unusually quiet, listening with visible satisfaction. Near the end of the meeting, he turned toward me and smiled. Without speaking, he seemed to be asking whether I believed the company was finally ready for its next chapter. I slowly stood and walked toward the large window overlooking the city. Looking down, I once again found my weathered pickup truck parked among polished luxury vehicles. That simple sight reminded me how quickly appearances could mislead people and how powerfully character could correct those mistakes. Turning back toward the board, I explained that leadership was never a reward for intelligence alone. Intelligence could build profitable companies, but only character could preserve them for generations. I announced that I had reached my decision regarding the future of the corporation. The room became completely silent. Several directors instinctively sat a little straighter. I surprised everyone by explaining that I would not become chief executive officer. My responsibility as owner was to protect the long-term direction of the company, not to manage its daily operations. Instead, I intended to appoint someone willing to continue learning rather than someone convinced they already possessed every answer. I looked directly at Ryan Mitchell. The young executive appeared genuinely shocked before quietly lowering his eyes. I explained that I was not selecting him because he had always been right. I was selecting him because he had demonstrated the rare ability to recognize when he had been wrong and then change without making excuses. That quality mattered more to me than any resume or financial achievement. Ryan stood slowly and admitted that only a few weeks earlier he would have accepted the promotion as proof of personal success. Now he understood it represented something far greater. It was a promise to protect the livelihoods of thousands of families who trusted the company with their futures. I extended my hand, and he accepted it with visible humility rather than celebration. The directors unanimously approved the appointment without debate. As the meeting concluded, Charles quietly gathered his belongings from the chairman's seat for the final time. Before leaving the room, he looked at me and softly said that my father would have been proud. Watching him walk toward retirement with peace instead of regret, I realized that the greatest victories in business were never measured by who gained power. They were measured by who prepared others to carry responsibility with wisdom after they were gone. The months that followed brought steady changes throughout Hawthorne Industrial Systems, but none of them happened through dramatic announcements or expensive publicity campaigns. Instead, the transformation appeared in hundreds of ordinary decisions made by people who had begun thinking differently. Ryan kept his promise to spend time every quarter working beside employees across the company. Other executives followed his example without being instructed. Factory visits became part of leadership development rather than public relations. Apprenticeship programs returned, giving experienced machinists the opportunity to train younger workers before retiring. Long-standing suppliers once again found themselves treated as valued partners instead of temporary bargaining pieces. Customers noticed the difference before financial analysts did. Service became more personal, communication became more honest, and trust continued growing stronger. Quarterly profits remained healthy, but they were no longer celebrated as the company's greatest achievement. Instead, the board measured success by employee retention, customer loyalty, workplace safety, and the strength of relationships built across generations. One crisp autumn morning, I returned to the original machine shop my father had founded outside Louisville. Although I no longer managed daily operations there, I visited often because the small brick building reminded me where every important lesson had begun. The old lathe my father had purchased decades earlier still stood near the back wall, carefully maintained by workers who understood its history. Running my hand across its worn steel surface, I remembered being a young boy sweeping metal shavings from the floor after school while listening to my father explain that every piece of quality work carried the name of the person who produced it, even when nobody else knew who they were. As I stood there remembering those afternoons, a familiar engine pulled into the parking lot. Ryan stepped out of his own pickup truck, which he admitted he had purchased used after deciding he no longer cared about driving something designed to impress strangers. He laughed as he looked at my weathered truck parked beside his. We walked through the shop together, speaking with employees who greeted us not as powerful executives but as people they knew by name. Ryan quietly admitted that leading the company had become far more challenging than he ever imagined. Every important decision affected thousands of families, and he felt that responsibility every single day. I told him that feeling the weight of responsibility was not a weakness. It was often the strongest evidence that someone deserved the privilege of leading others. Before leaving, I unlocked an old wooden cabinet and handed Ryan one of my father's original notebooks. Inside were handwritten observations collected over nearly 40 years of running a small manufacturing business. The pages contained no complicated management theories or financial formulas. They simply recorded lessons learned through keeping promises, treating people fairly, admitting mistakes honestly, and protecting reputations more carefully than profits. Ryan accepted the notebook with the same respect he had once shown my father's letter. As we stood outside watching employees finish another day's work, I realized something my father had understood long before I did. Wealth could purchase companies. Authority could assign titles. But neither could create the quiet respect that developed only after years of consistent integrity. Looking across the parking lot at two ordinary pickup trucks standing side by side, I smiled because the greatest investment my father had ever made was never hidden inside stock certificates or trust agreements. It had always been planted inside people willing to learn that character remained the most valuable asset any company could ever own. Several years passed more quickly than I ever expected. My hair became a little grayer, my steps became a little slower, and the old pickup truck gathered a few more scratches from countless miles across Kentucky and beyond. Yet every time I walked into a Hawthorne Industrial Systems facility, I felt the same quiet pride I had experienced during my very first visit after becoming the company's owner. The factories were busier than ever, apprenticeship programs had produced a new generation of skilled craftsmen, and experienced employees remained eager to teach those just beginning their careers. Customer relationships continued growing stronger because promises were still honored even when keeping them required extra effort. Ryan never stopped visiting production floors, suppliers, and customer sites. New executives quickly learned that leadership inside the company meant spending time with people doing the work rather than remaining behind conference room doors. The culture my father had protected through patience instead of publicity had not merely survived. It had become even stronger because more people now understood why it mattered. One spring afternoon, the company celebrated the opening of a new manufacturing facility. Hundreds of employees, local families, suppliers, and community leaders attended the ceremony. I stood quietly near the back of the crowd instead of on the main stage. Ryan delivered the opening remarks, thanking employees whose names would never appear in business magazines but whose dedication had built the company's future one careful decision at a time. To my surprise, he invited me forward before the ribbon was cut. As I approached the microphone, I looked across the audience and recognized faces from nearly every chapter of my journey. David Morales stood proudly beside several apprentices he had personally trained. Margaret Collins smiled from the front row with members of her family. Emily Foster continued greeting everyone with the same warmth she had shown on the day I first entered headquarters, carrying only a worn leather folder. Charles Hawthorne, now enjoying retirement, applauded with genuine satisfaction. Looking at all of them, I realized the story had never truly been about ownership. I told the audience that years earlier many people had judged an old pickup truck before they knew the man driving it. I admitted that their mistake had never offended me because appearances had always been temporary. Character remained permanent. I explained that the company succeeded not because one person bought it, but because thousands of ordinary people chose every day to keep their word, help one another, and place integrity ahead of convenience. Those values could never be purchased, inherited, or negotiated. They had to be practiced repeatedly until they became part of a person's identity. After the ceremony ended, I quietly returned to the parking lot. My old truck still waited exactly where I had left it, surrounded by vehicles that were newer, larger, and far more expensive. I smiled as I climbed behind the wheel because nothing about that familiar seat had changed the man I had become. Before starting the engine, I unfolded my father's final letter one more time and reread the sentence that had guided every decision since the day Charles placed the envelope into my hands. Never punish people for judging your appearance. Teach them to recognize character instead. I carefully folded the letter, placed it back inside the glove compartment, and drove home along the same Kentucky roads I had traveled for decades. The truck was still old. The clothes I wore were still simple. But I no longer wondered whether people would judge what they saw. I knew that sooner or later, character would always tell the story that appearances never could. On the morning of my 70th birthday, I followed the same routine I had kept for years. I poured a cup of coffee before sunrise, climbed into my old dark green pickup truck, and drove through the quiet Kentucky countryside as the first light reached the fields. Nothing about the morning suggested that I was the controlling owner of one of the most respected industrial companies in the country. That thought had never interested me very much anyway. What mattered was knowing that the people inside Hawthorne Industrial Systems were continuing to build something worthy of the trust placed in them. As I pulled into the parking lot of the original machine shop, several young apprentices were already unlocking the doors. Most of them had never met my father, yet they knew his name because every new employee was taught the history of the company before learning a single production process. They knew about the small shop, the long hours, the commitment to quality, and the belief that every handshake carried the same value as a signed contract. Watching those young men and women laugh together before starting work reminded me that values could outlive the people who first created them. Later that afternoon, Ryan arrived carrying a small wooden box. He explained that employees from every facility across the company had contributed something to it. Inside were hundreds of handwritten notes from machinists, engineers, receptionists, warehouse workers, maintenance technicians, truck drivers, suppliers, and customers. None of the messages discussed profits or stock ownership. Instead, they thanked me for preserving a culture where people felt respected, where experience was valued, where honesty was rewarded, and where leaders were expected to listen before making decisions. I quietly read several of the notes before closing the lid. They were worth more to me than any financial statement I had ever reviewed. Ryan smiled and admitted that many new employees still asked about the old pickup truck parked outside headquarters whenever I visited. They expected it to belong to a maintenance worker or a retired employee, and they were always surprised to discover who actually drove it. I laughed because some traditions deserved to continue. If someone chose to judge another person by clothing, a vehicle, or outward appearance, life usually found a patient way to correct that mistake. As the evening sun settled over the Kentucky hills, Ryan and I stood outside the shop watching another workday come to an end. Employees waved as they headed home to their families, carrying lunch boxes, tool bags, and the quiet satisfaction that came from honest work completed well. My father used to say that a successful day ended not when the machine stopped running but when every person could return home with dignity intact. Looking across that parking lot, I realized his words had become the true foundation of everything we had built together. Before leaving, I glanced once more at my weathered pickup truck, now older than many of the employees who admired it. It had never been a symbol of wealth or success. It had simply carried me through a lifetime of lessons that no luxury could ever teach. As I started the engine for the drive home, I understood that people would probably continue telling the story of the man who arrived in an old truck and quietly bought the company. But I hoped the lesson they remembered was something far greater. The most valuable thing anyone can own is a reputation earned through humility, integrity, and the quiet decision to treat every person with the same respect, regardless of what they happen to drive. Not long after my 70th birthday, I made one final journey that felt more important than any board meeting, acquisition, or business decision I had ever attended. On a quiet Saturday morning, I drove my old dark green pickup truck to the small country cemetery where my father had been buried many years before. The Kentucky air carried the familiar scent of fresh grass, and the surrounding fields looked much the same as they had when I was a young boy learning how to measure metal, sharpen tools, and keep promises. I carried no briefcase, no financial reports, and no ownership documents. In my hands rested only the weathered envelope containing my father's final letter and a small notebook filled with recent messages from employees throughout Hawthorne Industrial Systems. Standing beside the simple headstone, I quietly read several of those messages aloud. One came from a young apprentice who said he finally believed manufacturing could become a lifelong career because experienced workers had taken the time to teach him with patience. Another came from a customer who wrote that the company had honored a commitment even when doing so reduced its own profit. A third came from a supplier who said they no longer felt like an outside vendor but like part of one extended family working toward the same purpose. As I finished reading, I realized every one of those notes represented the kind of legacy my father had hoped to leave behind. His greatest achievement had never been building a successful business. It had been proving that integrity could continue growing long after the person who first practiced it was gone. I remained there for a long time, remembering the countless ordinary days we had spent together inside the little machine shop. At the time, those moments never seemed extraordinary. We swept floors, repaired equipment, greeted customers, and worked late whenever a promise needed to be kept. Looking back, I finally understood that character was never formed through extraordinary events. It was shaped by thousands of ordinary choices repeated faithfully over many years. Before leaving, I placed the notebook beside the headstone for a moment and quietly thanked my father for choosing humility over recognition, patience over pride, and purpose over wealth. Without those decisions, none of the people whose lives had been touched by the company would have shared the opportunities they now enjoyed. Driving home along the familiar back roads, I reflected on the remarkable journey that had begun the morning I first arrived at headquarters in an old pickup truck while strangers silently judged what they saw. They believed they were looking at an aging mechanic who had wandered into the wrong building. They could not have imagined they were meeting the man who quietly owned the company. Yet as the years passed, that surprising revelation became the least important part of the story. The true ending had nothing to do with hidden ownership, financial success, or unexpected wealth. It belonged to every employee who chose honesty when shortcuts were easier, every leader who learned to listen before speaking, every customer who trusted a promise, and every young apprentice who discovered that skill without character would never be enough. As my old pickup rolled back toward home beneath the wide Kentucky sky, I smiled because I finally understood that people might remember how I arrived. But what truly mattered was how all of us chose to leave the company stronger, kinder, and more trustworthy than we found it.
They remind us of who we are. I'm grateful for every single one of them.